Hello and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. In each episode, we read a short story and then discuss it. This week's story is The Haunted Doll's House by M.R James. Simone, you picked the story. Please can you tell us why?
M.R James was on my mind as a ghost story writer, so I wanted to get something of his. And I always feel like creepy dolls are weirdly underutilized, given I know they're a popular trope, but they're not used enough. I love a creepy doll house. I think you can do so much with them as a tool. So I really wanted to basically have a story with a haunted dollhouse because it's a personal obsession of mine. I don't have any other good reason. And I like the narrator. I thought it was quite cleverly framed. Thought I'd inflict it on you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the story and I thought of The Haunting of Bly Manor.
Yes.
They also have a creepy doll's house.
They do.
Alright, here is The Haunted Doll's House by M.R. James. I suppose you get stuff of that kind through your hands pretty often, said Mr. Dillett, as he pointed with his stick to an object, which shall be described when the time comes. And when he said it, he lied in his throat, and knew that he lied. Not once in 20 years, perhaps not once in a lifetime, could Mr. Chittenden, skilled as he was in ferreting out the forgotten treasures of half a dozen counties, expect to handle such a specimen. It was a collector's palaver, and Mr. Chittenden recognised it as such. Stuff of that kind, Mr. Dillett. It's a museum piece, that is. Well, I suppose there are museums that will take anything. I've seen one, not as good as that, years back, said Mr. Chittenden thoughtfully. But that's not likely to come into the market, and I'm told they have some fine ones of the period over the water. No, I'm only telling you the truth, Mr. Dillett, when I say that if you was to place an unlimited order with me for the very best that could be got, and you know, I have facilities for getting to know of such things, and a reputation to maintain, well, all I can say is, I should lead you straight up to that one and say, I can't do no better for you than that, sir. Hear, hear, said Mr. Dillett, applauding ironically with the end of his stick on the floor of the shop. How much are you sticking the innocent American buyer for it, eh? Oh, I shan't be over hard on the buyer, American or otherwise. You see it stands this way, Mr. Dillett. If I knew just a bit more about the pedigree. Or just a bit less, Mr. Dillett put in. Ha ha, you will have your jokes, sir. No, but as I was saying, if I knew just a little more than what I do about the piece, though anyone can see for themselves it's a genuine thing, every last corner of it, and there's not been one of my men allowed to so much as touch it since it came into the shop, there'd be another figure in the price I'm asking. And what's that, 5 and 20? Multiply that by 3 and you've got it, sir. 75's my price. And 50's mine, said Mr. Dillett. The point of agreement was, of course, somewhere between the two. It does not matter exactly where. I think 60 guineas. But half an hour later the object was being packed, and within an hour Mr. Dillett had called for it in his car and driven away. Mr. Chittenden, holding the cheque in his hand, saw him off from the door with smiles and returned, still smiling, into the parlour where his wife was making the tea. He stopped at the door. It's gone, he said. Thank God for that, said Mrs. Chittenden, putting down the teapot. Mr. Dillett, was it? Yes, it was. Well, I'd sooner it was him than another. Oh, I don't know. He ain't a bad feller, my dear. Maybe not, but in my opinion he'd be none the worse for a bit of a shake-up. Well, if that's your opinion, it's my opinion he's put himself into the way of getting one. Anyhow, we shan't have no more of it, and that's something to be thankful for. And so Mr. and Mrs. Chittenden sat down to tea. And what of Mr. Dillett and of his new acquisition? What it was, the title of this story will have told you. What it was like, I shall have to indicate as well as I can. There was only just room enough for it in the car, and Mr. Dillett had to sit with the driver. He had also to go slow, for though the rooms of the doll's house had all been stuffed carefully with soft cotton wool, jolting was to be avoided in view of the immense number of small objects which thronged them, and the 10-mile drive was an anxious time for him, in spite of all the precautions he insisted upon. At last his front door was reached, and Collins, the butler, came out. Look here, Collins, you must help me with this thing. It's a delicate job. We must get it out upright, see? It's full of little things that mustn't be displaced more than we can help. Let's see, where shall we have it? After a pause for consideration. Really, I shall have to put it in my own room to begin with, at any rate. On the big table, that's it. It was conveyed, with much talking, to Mr. Dillett's spacious room on the first floor, looking out on the drive. The sheeting was unwound from it and the front thrown open, and for the next hour or two Mr. Dillett was fully occupied in extracting the padding and setting in order the content of the rooms. When this thoroughly congenial task was finished, I must say that it would have been difficult to find a more perfect and attractive specimen of a doll's house in Strawberry Hill Gothic than that which now stood on Mr. Dillett's large knee-hole table, lighted up by the evening sun which came slanting through 3 tall sash windows. It was quite 6 feet long, including the chapel or oratory which flanked the front on the left as you faced it, and the stable on the right. The main block of the house was, as I have said, in the Gothic manner. That is to say, the windows had pointed arches and were surmounted by what are called ogival hoods, with crockets and finials such as we see on the canopies of tombs built into church walls. At the angles were absurd turrets covered with arched panels. The chapel had pinnacles and buttresses, and a bell in the turret, and coloured glass in the windows. When the front of the house was open, you saw 4 large rooms, bedroom, dining room, drawing room, and kitchen, each with its appropriate furniture in a very complete state. The stable on the right was in 2 stories, with its proper complement of horses, coaches, and grooms, and with its clock and Gothic cupola for the clock bell. Pages, of course, might be written on the outfit of the mansion, how many frying pans, how many gilt chairs, what pictures, carpets, chandeliers, 4-posters, table linen, glass, crockery, and plate it possessed. But all this must be left to the imagination. I will only say that the base or plinth on which the house stood, for it was fitted with one of some depth, which allowed of a flight of steps to the front door and a terrace, partly balustraded, contained a shallow drawer or drawers in which were neatly stored sets of embroidered curtains, changes of raiment for the inmates, and in short, all the materials for an infinite series of variations and refittings of the most absorbing and delightful kind. Quintessence of Horace Walpole, that's what it is. He must have had something to do with the making of it. Such was Mr. Dillett's murmured reflection as he knelt before it in a reverent ecstasy. Simply wonderful. This is my day, and no mistake. £500 coming in this morning for that cabinet which I never cared about, and now this tumbling into my hands for a tenth, at the very most of what it would fetch in town. Well, well, it almost makes one afraid something will happen to counter it. Let's have a look at the population anyhow. Accordingly, he set them before him in a row. Again, here is an opportunity, which some would snatch at, of making an inventory of costume. I am incapable of it. There was a gentleman and lady in blue satin and brocade respectively. There were 2 children, a boy and a girl. There was a cook, a nurse, a footman, and there were the stable servants, 2 postilions, a coachman, 2 grooms. Anyone else? Yes, possibly. The curtains of the 4-poster in the bedroom were closely drawn round all 4 sides of it, and he put his finger in between them and felt in the bed. He drew the finger back hastily, for it almost seemed to him as if something had, not stirred perhaps, but yielded, in an odd live way as he pressed it. Then he put back the curtains, which ran on rods in the proper manner, and extracted from the bed a white-haired old gentleman in a long linen nightdress and cap, and laid him down by the rest. The tale was complete. Dinner time was now near, so Mr. Dillett spent but 5 minutes in putting the lady and children into the drawing-room, the gentleman into the dining-room, the servants into the kitchen and stables, and the old man back into his bed. He retired into his dressing-room next door, and we see and hear no more of him until something like 11 o'clock at night. His whim was to sleep, surrounded by some of the gems of his collection. The big room in which we have seen him contained his bed, bath, wardrobe, and all of the appliances of dressing were in a commodious room adjoining, but his 4-poster, which itself was a valued treasure, stood in the large room where he sometimes wrote, and often sat, and even received visitors. Tonight he repaired to it in a highly complacent frame of mind. There was no striking clock within earshot, none on the staircase, none in the stable, none in the distant church tower. Yet it is indubitable that Mr. Dillett was startled out of a very pleasant slumber by a bell tolling 1. He was so much startled that he did not merely lie breathless with wide-open eyes, but actually sat up in his bed. He never asked himself, till the morning hours, how it was that, though there was no light at all in the room, the doll's house on the knee-hole table stood out with complete clearness. But it was so. The effect was that of a bright harvest moon, shining full on the front of a big white stone mansion, a quarter of a mile away it might be, and yet every detail was photographically sharp. There were trees about it too, trees rising behind the chapel and the house. He seemed to be conscious of the scent of a cool, still September night. He thought he could hear an occasional stamp and clink from the stables, as of horses stirring, and with another shock he realised that, above the house, he was looking, not at the wall of his room with its pictures, but into the profound blue of a night sky. There were lights, more than one, in the windows, and he quickly saw that this was no four-roomed house with a movable front, but one of many rooms and staircases, a real house, but seen as if through the wrong end of a telescope. "You mean to show me something," he muttered to himself, and he gazed earnestly on the lighted windows. They would in real life have been shuttered or curtained, no doubt, he thought, but as it was, there was nothing to intercept his view of what was being transacted inside the rooms. 2 rooms were lighted, one on the ground floor to the right of the door, one upstairs on the left, the first brightly enough, the other rather dimly. The lower room was the dining room. A table was laid, but the meal was over, and only wine and glasses were left on the table. The man of the blue satin and the woman of the brocade were alone in the room, and they were talking very earnestly, seated close together at the table, their elbows on it, every now and again stopping to listen, as it seemed. Once he rose, came to the window and opened it, and put his head out and his hand to his ear. There was a lighted taper and a silver candlestick on a sideboard. When the man left the window, he seemed to leave the room also, and the lady, taper in hand, remained standing and listening. The expression on her face was that of one striving her utmost to keep down a fear that threatened to master her, and succeeding. It was a hateful face too, broad, flat, and sly. Now the man came back, and she took some small thing from him and hurried out of the room. He too disappeared, but only for a moment or two. The front door slowly opened, and he stepped out and stood on top of the perron, looking this way and that, then turned towards the upper window that was lighted and shook his fist. It was time to look at that upper window. Through it was seen a 4-post bed, a nurse or other servant in an armchair, evidently sound asleep. In the bed, an old man, lying, awake, and one would say anxious, from the way in which he shifted about and moved his fingers, beating tunes on the coverlet. Beyond the bed, a door opened. Light was seen on the ceiling, and the lady came in. She set down her candle on the table, came to the fireside, and roused the nurse. In her hand she had an old-fashioned wine bottle, ready uncorked. The nurse took it, poured some of the contents into a little silver saucepan, added some spice and sugar from the castors on the table, and set it to warm on the fire. Meanwhile, the old man in the bed beckoned feebly to the lady, who came to him, smiling, took his wrist as if to feel his pulse, and bit her lip as if in consternation. He looked at her anxiously, and then pointed to the window, and spoke. She nodded, and did as the man below had done, opened the casement and listened, perhaps rather ostentatiously, then drew in her head and shook it, looking at the old man, who seemed to sigh. By this time the posset on the fire was steaming, and the nurse poured it into a small 2-handled silver bowl and brought it to the bedside. The old man seemed disinclined for it and was waving it away, but the lady and the nurse together bent over him and evidently pressed it upon him. He must have yielded, for they supported him into a sitting position and put it to his lips. He drank most of it, in several draughts, and they laid him down. The lady left the room, smiling good night to him, and took the bowl, the bottle, and the silver saucepan with her. The nurse returned to the chair, and there was an interval of complete quiet. Suddenly the old man started up in his bed, and he must have uttered some cry, for the nurse started out of her chair and made but one step of it to the bedside. He was a sad, terrible sight, flushed in the face, almost to blackness, the eyes glaring whitely, both hands clutching at his heart, foam at his lips. For a moment the nurse left him, ran to the door, flung it wide open, and, one supposes, screamed aloud for help, then darted back to the bed and seemed to try feverishly to soothe him, to lay him down, anything. But as the lady, her husband, and several servants rushed into the room with horrified faces, the old man collapsed under the nurse's hands and lay back, and the features, contorted with agony and rage, relaxed slowly into calm. A few moments later, lights showed out to the left of the house, and a coach with flambeaux drove up to the door. A white-wigged man in black got nimbly out and ran up the steps, carrying a small leather trunk-shaped box. He was met in the doorway by the man and his wife, she with her handkerchief clutched between her hands, he with a tragic face, but retaining his self-control. They led the newcomer into the dining room, where he set his box of papers on the table, and, turning to them, listened with a face of consternation at what they had to tell. He nodded his head again and again, threw out his hand slightly, declined, it seemed, offers of refreshment and lodging for the night, and within a few minutes came slowly down the steps, entering the coach and driving off the way he had come. As the man in blue watched him from the top of the steps, a smile not pleasant to see stole slowly over his fat white face. Darkness fell over the whole scene as the lights of the coach disappeared. But Mr. Dillett remained sitting up in the bed. He had rightly guessed that there would be a sequel. The house front glimmered out again before long, but now there was a difference. The lights were in other windows, one at the top of the house, the other illuminating the range of coloured windows of the chapel. How he saw through these is not quite obvious, but he did. The interior was as carefully furnished as the rest of the establishment, with its minute red cushions on the desks, its Gothic stool canopies, and its western gallery and pinnacled organ with gold pipes. On the centre of the black and white pavement was a bier. 4 tall candles burned at the corners. On the bier was a coffin covered with a pall of black velvet. As he looked, the folds of the pall stirred. It seemed to rise at one end. It slid downwards. It fell away, exposing the black coffin with its silver handles and nameplate. One of the tall candlesticks swayed and toppled over. Ask no more, but turn, as Mr. Dillett hastily did, and look in at the lighted window at the top of the house, where a boy and girl lay in 2 truckle beds, and a 4-poster for the nurse rose above them. The nurse was not visible for the moment, but the father and mother were there, dressed now in mourning, but with very little sign of mourning in their demeanour. Indeed, they were laughing and talking with a good deal of animation, sometimes to each other, and sometimes throwing a remark to one or other of the children, and again laughing at the answers. Then the father was seen to go on tiptoe out of the room, taking with him as he went a white garment that hung on a peg near the door. He shut the door after him. A minute or 2 later it was slowly opened again, and a muffled head poked round it. A bent form of sinister shape stepped across to the truckle beds, and suddenly stopped, threw up its arms, and revealed, of course, the father laughing. The children were in agonies of terror, the boy with the bedclothes over his head, the girl throwing herself out of bed into her mother's arms. Attempts at consolation followed. The parents took the children on their laps, patted them, picked up the white gown, and showed there was no harm in it, and so forth, and at last, putting the children back into bed, left the room with encouraging waves of the hand. As they left it, the nurse came in, and soon the light died down. Still, Mr. Dillett watched, immovable. A new sort of light, not of lamp or candle, a pale ugly light, began to dawn around the door-case at the back of the room. The door was opening again. The seer does not like to dwell upon what he saw entering the room. He says it might be described as a frog, the size of a man, but it had scanty white hair about its head. It was busy about the truckle beds, but not for long. The sound of cries, faint, as if coming out of a vast distance, but even so, infinitely appalling, reached the ear. There were signs of a hideous commotion all over the house. Lights moved along and up, and doors opened and shut, and running figures passed within the windows. The clock in the stable turret told 1, and darkness fell again. It was only dispelled once more to show the house front. At the bottom of the steps, dark figures were drawn up in 2 lines, holding flaming torches. More dark figures came down the steps, bearing, first one, then another small coffin, and the lines of torch-bearers, with the coffins between them, moved silently onward to the left. The hours of night passed on. Never so slowly, Mr. Dillett thought. Gradually he sank down from sitting to lying in his bed, but he did not close an eye, and early next morning he sent for the doctor. The doctor found him in a disquieting state of nerves and recommended sea air. To a quiet place on the east coast he accordingly repaired by easy stages in his car. One of the first people he met on the seafront was Mr. Chittenden, who, it appeared, had likewise been advised to take his wife away for a bit of a change. Mr. Chittenden looked somewhat askance upon him when they met, and not without cause. "Well, I don't wonder at you being a bit upset, Mr. Dillett." "What? Yes, well, I might say 'orrible upset, to be sure, seeing what me and my poor wife went through ourselves. But I put it to you, Mr. Dillett, one of 2 things. Was I going to scrap a lovely piece like that on the one hand, or was I going to tell customers, 'I'm selling you a regular picture palace drama in real life of the olden time, billed to perform regular at 1 o'clock a.m.' Why, what would you have said yourself? And next thing you know, 2 justices of the peace in the back parlour, and poor Mr. and Mrs. Chittenden off in a spring cart to the county asylum, and everyone in the street saying, 'Ah, I thought it had come to that. Look at the way the man drank,' and me next door, or next door but one, to a total abstainer, as you know. Well, there was my position. What? Me have it back in the shop? Well, what do you think? No, but I'll tell you what I will do. You shall have your money back. bar the £10 I paid for it, and you make what you can." Later in the day, in what is offensively called the smoke room of the hotel, a murmured conversation between the two went on for some time. "How much do you really know about that thing, and where it came from?" "Honest, Mr. Dillett, I don't know the house. Of course, it came out of the lumber room of a country house, that anyone could guess, but I'll go as far as say this, that I believe it's not 100 miles from this place. Which direction and how far, I've no notion. I'm only judging by guesswork. The man as actually paid the cheque to ain't one of my regular men, and I've lost sight of him, but I have the idea that this part of the country was his beat, and that's every word I can tell you. But now, Mr. Dillett, there's one thing that rather physics me. That old chap. I suppose you saw him drive up to the door." "I thought so. Now, would he have been the medical man, do you take it?" "My wife would have it so, but I stuck to it that was the lawyer, because he had papers with him, and one he took out was folded up." "I agree," said Mr. Dillett. "Thinking it over, I came to conclusion that was the old man's will, ready to be signed." "Just what I thought," said Mr. Chittenden. "And I took it that will would have cut out the young people, eh? Well, well, it's been a lesson to me, I know that. I shan't buy no more dolls' houses, nor waste no more money on the pictures. And as to this business of poisoning Grandpa, well, if I know myself, I never had much of a turn for that. Live and let live, that's been my motto throughout life, and I ain't found it a bad one." Filled with these elevated sentiments, Mr. Chittenden retired to his lodgings. Mr. Dillett next day repaired to the local institute, where he hoped to find some clue to the riddle that absorbed him. He gazed in despair at a long file of the Canterbury and York Society's publications of the parish registers of the district. No print resembling the house of his nightmare was among those that hung on the staircase and in the passages. Disconsolate, he found himself at last in a derelict room, staring at a dusty model of a church in a dusty glass case. Model of St. Stephen's Church, Coxham, presented by J. Merewether, Esquire of Ilbridge House, 1877. The work of his ancestor James Merewether, dated 1786. There was something in the fashion of it that reminded him dimly of his horror. He retraced his steps to a wall map he had noticed, and made out that Ilbridge House was in Coxham parish. Coxham was, as it happened, one of the parishes of which he had retained the name when he glanced over the file of printed registers, and it was not long before he found in them the record of the burial of Roger Milford, aged 76, on the 11th of September 1757, and of Roger and Elizabeth Merewether, aged 9 and 7, on the 19th of the same month. It seemed worthwhile to follow up this clue, frail as it was, and in the afternoon he drove out to Coxham. The east end of the north aisle of the church is a Milford chapel, and on its north wall are tablets to the same persons. Roger, the elder it seems, was distinguished by all the qualities which adorn the father, the magistrate, and the man. The memorial was erected by his attached daughter Elizabeth, who did not long survive the loss of a parent, ever solicitous for her welfare, and of 2 amiable children. The last sentence was plainly an addition to the original inscription. A yet later slab told of James Merewether, husband of Elizabeth, who in the dawn of life practised, not without success, those arts which, had he continued their exercise, might, in the opinion of the most competent judges, have earned for him the name of the British Vitruvius, but who, overwhelmed by the visitation which deprived him of an affectionate partner and a blooming offspring, passed his prime and age in a secluded yet elegant retirement. His grateful nephew and heir indulges a pious sorrow by this too brief recital of his excellences. The children were more simply commemorated. Both died on the night of the 12th of September. Mr. Dillett felt sure that in Ilbridge House he had found the scene of his drama. In some old sketchbook, possibly in some old print, he may yet find convincing evidence that he is right. But the Ilbridge House of today is not that which he sought. It is an Elizabethan erection of the 40s in red brick, with stone quorns and dressings. A quarter of a mile from it, in a low part of the park, backed by ancient stag-horned, ivy-strangled trees and thick undergrowth, are marks of a terraced platform overgrown with rough grass. A few stone balusters lie here and there, and a heap or two, covered with nettles and ivy, of wrought stones with badly carved crockets. This, someone told Mr. Dillett, was the site of an older house. As he drove out of the village, the hall clock struck 4, and Mr. Dillett started up and clapped his hands to his ears. It was not the first time he had heard that bell. Awaiting an offer from the other side of the Atlantic, the doll's house still reposes, carefully sheeted, in a loft over Mr. Dillett's stables, whither Collins conveyed it on the day when Mr. Dillett started for the sea coast. What did you think of the story, Matt?
I like the story. It was pretty interesting. It's framed kind of differently, I suppose I would say. It's unusual way to tell a story. The framing narrative I thought was a bit weaker, maybe. I mean, what actually happens in the doll's house is pretty interesting, and the fact that the doll's house exists is interesting, but I felt like everything outside of that was maybe a little bit underutilized. But yeah, it's a fun story.
So you would have liked more of a focus on the doll's house rather than how our unfortunate narrator came to obtain it.
I just wanted a bit more either explanation or just a bit more to going on, because it's really just like he finds it, sees it, and then tries to sell it, and that's the story.
I quite liked that beginning where he sort of falls in love with the dollhouse.
Yeah, because you know from the start that it's going to obviously be haunted. Like, you know something's wrong with it. So it's almost like delayed, like, oh god, mate, don't do it. And I like the switch where the narrator very obviously kind of references such a going, you saw the title of this dollhouse, so I probably don't need to tell you.
I thought that was very funny.
It amused me more than it should have done.
Like, they talk about it in this abstract sense, oh, what is it that he's buying? And you know full well what it is. So why hide it?
Like, I read that M.R. James liked telling his ghost stories to all his friends, so I heard. And it kind of, I feel like you can get that from the narrative tone of voice, like it reads like someone's telling you the story around a fire.
Yeah.
It does seem like it was written that way.
I just imagine him doing all the voices.
Yeah, I think it'll be a fun one to listen to. I liked the story. I liked the idea of the dolls coming to life, even though it's been done a few times. It's just always good because there's something quite eerie about seeing an ordinary house shrunk down to like a quarter of the size, and the sort of inhabitants where usually you or a child would be the one moving around telling your own stories. There's something quite creepy about them telling their own story instead, like having that life to them.
I think I love the gothic doubling element of it. Like, there are just so many ways you could do it. Like, you could have a miniature version of the house you're actually in to, like, do creepy things, or, like, you could have it, like, as in this story, you can have it another house that you then need to kind of chase down, or whatever. Like, I don't know, I just think it's really cool as a tool. It's like mini microcosm.
Anyway, what did you think of the narrator?
I found him hilarious.
He's kind of chill.
Why did you find him hilarious?
Like, he just had things like brackets, like, pause for effect. And it just, like, just amused me.
I was never sure if it was something the narrator was saying or like a note just for somebody outside the story to read. I was like, am I supposed to take it that this is what the narrator is doing, or what is going on?
I kind of took it as a narrator telling us it, but he's also doing all his like little notations, like after pause for consideration. And like, you probably gathered from the title, and I don't know, I just appreciated it. I rarely see narrators kind of meta commenting on the act of narrating, so it was interesting.
It's true. So maybe a very early version of breaking the fourth wall, almost. You've seen that popular in TV where the character will like look at the camera or talk to the camera. I think it became known as fleabagging for a while after the TV show. I don't know if people still use that, given Fleabag is now a couple of years old. But yeah, I suppose this is like the narrative equivalent of turning around and like kind of, I don't know, like making eye contact with the audience. Would either of you ever do that in one of your stories?
Well, break the fourth wall. Yeah, it's fun. I like metafiction. Unfortunately, most people don't, apparently.
Oh, that's sad.
Really?
Seems to be pretty hard to do.
I mean, I know it was a trend in postmodernism a lot, wasn't it? I don't know if people just got sick of it after it.
Maybe. Seems to be pretty hard sell. You need to have a good reason for doing it. There's a few really good stories that I read that were metafiction on my course, but I don't remember what any of them were called.
No worries. I would actually like to read a few more of them because I read one where the concept, I don't know if it was really metafiction, but the concept of it was that invented people could like inhabit and walk around in the real world. And of course, the main character falls in love with one. It was a very strange book, but I quite enjoyed it. I think it was called The Fictionals.
Everyone always references Stranger Than Fiction. Is that what it's called, the film?
Is that the one where they kind of narrate? There's like a narrator talking over what the character's doing while he's brushing his teeth.
Yeah, and he becomes aware that he's a character in a story, and then he goes and finds the
Yeah,
author.
I like that
That's the one.
movie. It's fun. I like that he has a big confrontation with his author. But then it also fills me with dread because I don't know what my characters would want to say to me. I can't imagine it would be anything good.
I know, it's interesting because, side note, Bret Easton Ellis, most famous for American Psycho, possibly, did a story called Luna Park in which he had a fictionalized version of himself as the author, and also had the main lead / serial killer from American Psycho running around causing chaos in the plot. So it's interesting.
That sounds
I
quite
would
fun.
recommend. I would recommend it. It's a good book. I think particularly in the Gothic, there is a lot of works that kind of lean into this idea of like Gothic authorship and what it means to kind of have power over the text, or for the text to have too much power over you as the author, aka like with the Luna Park, the idea is that the book and the character got so powerful that it's out the author's control and it's come to life and it's got this power of its own. While arguably in, for example, The Shining, it's kind of like the author is kind of getting swallowed up by the work instead. Like they don't have enough power, almost too little or too much control over the thing. And like, where does inspiration come from? Because it can feel like something out of you. Okay, what if it actually is?
Oh my god, you mean like your own character could come back and kill you?
Yeah, like, did you come up with that idea? Like, can you say for sure where it came from if you just had a strike of, like, oh, inspiration? I think it often plays with. The House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski is also a very good example, I think, of this kind of playing with constructing stories and using it for, like, horror purposes. Obviously, this story uses it more for comedic effect than horror, but interesting nonetheless.
I don't even know if this counts in the story, because isn't he just describing how the characters are talking?
Maybe, but then he does do the things like refer to the title, which is inherently outside of the story.
That's true. Yeah, okay, I guess it counts.
Like, he doesn't lean into it a lot, but he does play with it. And I think it kind of adds to the sense that we, as the listener / reader, are getting the story at a distance through both the narrator as a distance and then from the fact that he's watching the dollhouse, it's not happening directly to him.
And this has all been reported to the narrator from somebody else.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Yeah. Like, it's classic, very unreliable narrator, isn't it? To a point in that we don't actually know what really happened.
I always wonder if that's just because how gossip spread then. So this was just the people's way of getting information and stories.
Yeah.
Like, if you read the story, like, around M.R James' time, you wouldn't think, oh, well, I don't know if it really happened because I don't know the original source of it. You would just think, oh my god, I can't believe this really happened, and, like, otherwise, why would I hear it on the grapevine? I guess we're trained now to always think about what we're being told because it's so easy to find the wrong information because we have so much information coming at us all the time. We have to think about where it's coming from and if the person behind it has any greater motives. But I'm guessing when the story was around, not really. Or maybe people didn't really think about it as much. Because it seems to be quite, we've said this before, it seems to be quite a common feature of older stories that the narrator is separate to any of the characters in the story itself, which feels odd to us now because we're used to the character being directly involved in the story.
I was just going to say, do you think that adds or takes away from the story?
It's just different.
Yeah.
I mean, no matter what you do, there's no getting away from the fact that someone is writing this, so it is being told to you by someone.
True.
It's just that we tend to try and hide the author in modern fiction sometimes, but not everybody does. It's just a different style. Like, any of Terry Pratchett's stuff is very obviously him narrating it. It just feels that way, right?
I think there are advantages to using both, probably disadvantages to using both as well.
Narrative distance, right? So you can get closer to your character or you can get further away. If you're further away, there are some advantages because you can show, well, you have more freedom in what you can show, I suppose, because you can choose to focus on certain things and not really have it imply anything about the characters. And you can maybe interface with some more intense emotions without it getting ridiculous. You know, there's things you can do easier at a more distance. perspective.
Good point.
Yeah, I was thinking the main advantage of being, I guess, having inherit to be internal to the story is that the stakes are higher personally for them, so you get a bit more heightened emotion into the narration, the narration, which is something that I quite enjoy because I love melodrama. So, would you sell someone a haunted dollhouse?
I mean, depends on the level of
it's not like
haunting.
it does any harm, is it?
Yeah, I'd sell this one because it's not like it's trying to kill you.
See, if it were me, I'd just throw it in the tip. Get rid of that thing.
Why? If you can get money for it.
Do you think maybe...
What if you anger the ghost?
Yeah, and maybe... Exactly, you might be afraid of being cursed or something.
I suppose. I just thought it was interesting that his first instinct was, I have a haunted dollhouse, I guess that I'll sell it. For me, it would be like, burn!
I mean, he has a shop, right? He probably bought it with the intention of selling it. It just so happened to be haunted.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay. I guess that makes sense. I don't think I would sell anybody haunted wares.
I would.
I just feel like it would come back to bite me. You would. Okay.
You gotta get rid of it somehow.
Also, if you tell people it's actually haunted, you could probably up the price because you get people who love stuff like that.
I guess if you were trying to sell it to M.R. James, you would definitely tell him that it was haunted.
Yeah, you'd immediately buy it then.
Yeah, exactly. So you'd have to try and figure out which customers were really into ghosts.
Can't be that hard to find them.
It's possible I'm thinking too hard about this part of the story.
You're right, he wasn't thinking very economically, was he? He was thinking, I just want to get rid of this thing. What about this guy? He looks like he'll probably take it, sucker.
But he's still, I think it was still 60 something pounds. I don't remember.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what that is in real money.
No, I was just trying to figure out if I could calculate it, but I have no idea.
What year was this story written?
It's 18 something, I think.
1890-ish? That's £7,500.
1923.
Oh, god damn it.
Sorry, I ruined your maths.
£60 in 1920, did you say?
1923.
About £2,000.
I would definitely sell it if I could get £2,000 for it.
Yeah, now I'm seeing it different.
But given the size of that thing, it was 6 feet long. It should be worth a lot more than that. I see his point.
It would have been beautifully crafted is the kind of impression we're given.
I just don't know where I would put it.
I think if you can afford it, then you probably live in a mansion, right?
Yeah, I think they have a special room in mansions back in the day where they could put stuff like that. I imagine it's kind of like my friend's room where he keeps all his Legos. I don't know if he still has that room, but it was a great room. He had all his Harry Potter and Star Wars Lego sets built up.
He should cover the walls in Lego, so the whole thing is just Lego.
I'll suggest that next time I see him. Anyway, next question. I thought the end where he just happens to bump into Mr. Chittenden at the beach was one heck of a coincidence. I think he gets away with it because he kind of needs to see him again, but I don't know. I think I would have written some more drama into him going, oh no, I need to go and get a refund, or I don't know, just having him bump into him seemed very strange.
Yeah, given there are plenty of ways, he'd have a reason to go see him again after what happened.
You could have just written, hey, I'll go see this guy and ask him if he knew it was haunted and ask him some questions. That would have been perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's the character doesn't even act. He's just pushed into the meeting by the narrative. It seemed a strange choice to me. Maybe the idea is that you're supposed to understand how distressed he is by the doll's house.
He was so distressed he was sent to the beach by his doctor.
Yeah. How come the doctor never does that for me when I go? That's what I want to know.
You're clearly not suitably hysterical.
Must be it. So, how do you think you get away with coincidence in stories?
Mostly gets away with it in this one, let's be honest, and it's because he could have easily written something that would make sense and just didn't for some reason. And the other reason is because you can't have a coincidence that fixes your character's problems.
Yeah,
and
basically.
This doesn't really do that. There's no real stakes in whether he finds this Chittenden guy or not.
Yeah, it's not what the heart of the story is.
So if he'd happened to instead find what happened to all the people's names like he does towards the end of what he thinks the house was based on without any effort, that would have not really worked. But because it's just bumping into
that would be fine. I don't care about that either.
You don't care about that either? Okay.
If he had I don't know, walked into the library, found some random book, and it told him everything about the history of this doll's house and where it came from and who built it and everything there is to know, that would have been a bit suspect.
Yeah.
But, I mean, at this point in the story, the character doesn't really have any conflict, so you can't really upset me by resolving it, because there isn't any.
Yeah, it's more traditional ghost story in that it's telling you this is a cool thing that happened, this thing is haunted, rather than setting it up that he has to beat the dollhouse or anything.
I think that's why I didn't engage with the framing narrative so much, is because there's not really any stakes. Kind of not even really a story in some ways. It's just, oh, I found a doll's house and it's haunted, that's weird. The end.
Traditional ghost story, isn't it? Because a lot of them don't. Like, the conflict is within the, meta narrative of what happened in the dollhouse, of, the grandfather being murdered.
Yeah, I was going to mention that part is quite horrific. And then children as well. And then I imagined it playing out night after night after night after night, and there's something so creepy about that.
The creepiest thing for me is that we don't know how the hell this thing came into existence. Did somebody make this? Did it just happen? Is it haunted? Like, actually haunted? Like, there's a ghost that's doing it? And why? For what reason?
Because it wants justice, wants the truth known.
Maybe.
I imagined that the grandfather made the house.
Yeah, so there's something of him in the house. I mean, I think it was quite common that you used to be able to get, like, doll's house versions of your, like, manor. Like, it was a popular children's toy back in the day, wasn't it?
Yes, I'm sure. I think it was very popular among the wealthy that they would have their little custom dolls' houses, and they would probably not be built by family but by craftsmen. But this feels so personal to me that I just imagined that he must have had a hand in its creation, and that he wants his story to be told.
Could be the grandfather embodying it's possessing the house then.
Yeah.
I think that those questions have power because we don't really know or understand what's happening. I think if they explained that at the end, like, oh, it was his ghost that was doing it, it would just be really lame. Kind of undermine the story.
So you think it's better that it wasn't really explained?
Yeah.
I agree. I like that you can make the inference. Okay, so in this story, we have a cursed object in the form of the doll's house, and this is, as Simone said, a very popular trope in ghost stories. And I wondered if you had any favourite examples or any thoughts on how to use them effectively.
I have examples, but they're all from fantasy.
Okay.
I know. I'm like, surely there's a ghost story in my head somewhere. No, can't find one.
What about the
With
monkeys?
a cursed object.
What about the fountain?
Yeah, we do have the monkey's paw. What was that, Simone?
I was going to say, what about the fountain of youth in the recent story? It's kind of a cursed object that we did.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah?
The water is cursed or blessed, depending on how you look at it.
Seems pretty cursed to me.
What were your fantasy versions?
There's a few. There's like different kinds. I was thinking about this. There's like the ones that are like sentient and like have a will of their own, I suppose. Like often weapons, actually. I was thinking the sword in Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. I think it's called Nightblood sword. And it's sentient. It like kind of influences whoever's wielding it. And its purpose was to destroy evil, but they never gave it any morality, so it basically just wants to murder everyone. And that was a fun cursed object. There's more. They're really popular having like blades be cursed. I don't know why. I guess
I suppose
it's just easy.
It's because the blade is so powerful you can take someone's life with it.
Yeah. Like in Sekiro, there's a sword where if you draw it, you die instantly. I think that's pretty crazy, and they do some cool things with it in the story. And then there's like a different kind, which is like it's cursed, but the curse seems to almost come from outside of it, like the world bends around it or something. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I think my best example is the one from Berserk. There's like this weird egg thing. Berserk, the manga series. There's this egg that basically allows you to summon the devil and make some kind of horrible deal with him. And it like has this thing on it where it just shows up to the person who's going to use it at the right moment. And there's a scene where they just like throw it down a drain. They're like, we're never getting that back. Screw this thing. And then what do you know? What just happens to have come rolling down the river at just the right moment, or the wrong moment if you're the protagonist of the story, I suppose. And that's pretty interesting. That was a good one.
I can think of some fairy tale kind of equivalents. Like, I'm not sure if Excalibur. Excalibur is not exactly cursed, but isn't it like a blessed sword?
Supposedly.
Yeah, it's got some kind of magical property to it, and
The scabbard makes you immortal.
yeah, that's a pretty big deal. And in some stories, immortality is a curse.
So it's not a cursed object.
I had one, the other one I was thinking of, I can't remember who wrote it. It was a short story with a bottle where a demon lived in it. Like a cursed bottle, and you had to sell it for less than you bought it for to get rid of it.
Interesting. That's like a game of hot potato, isn't it? Like, because the number's just going to shrink. Eventually, you're just going to have to give it away, and then what's the final person going to do? Stuck with it.
You're stuck, you've given your soul away at that point. In the story, they need something smaller than $1, so they end up trying to find like foreign currencies that can go for smaller and smaller and smaller amounts, to, like passing it between more people. It's a good story. I should try and find it, but I can't remember for the life of me what it was called or who it was by. I know it was one I read for the podcast and thought about using and didn't.
Ghost story that's solved by economics.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's good if you like maths.
I think the one that stuck with me most was the videotape in the ring. If you've ever seen it, you know, you play the video, you die in 7 days. I thought that was a great tool. Like, I think cursed objects are a great tool in fiction because they can be used in so many different ways, like to drive the plot forward, to force a choice in the character, to set a time limit on your story. Like, is the whole point that they're trying to keep this cursed object from ever getting out? Like,
and they have their own motivations. It ends up being pretty interesting.
I guess it's just an easy way to generate a story, is to have some kind of thing set it off.
Would you say that this story uses its cursed object effectively?
Yes.
See, it's cursed, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't, like, hurt you or anything.
It makes you watch a horrid play about somebody getting murdered in the middle of the night. I don't imagine you'll be getting much sleep with all the murder going on.
It's his fault for sleeping next to it.
But then I guess it kind of raises a point if the point of all horror is that something's trying to hurt you, or if the horror is the repetition, like ghosts are points of trauma, aren't they? They're like a constant reliving of something terrible that happened, and in that sense, the dollhouse is kind of a perfect representation of that. It's like the sadness of the ghost story rather than the kind of cruelty of it almost.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was saying before. I feel like the horror of it comes from the fact that we don't understand like why this thing exists or what's created it or was driving it or anything.
Or what would make it stop. Yeah, I think there is a deep fear of doing the same thing over and over again and having the same terrible result.
Isn't that just life?
Yeah. No, we learn from our mistakes in life, but these ghosts can't learn anything because it's too late for them.
Yeah, and they literally can't move on. Just doomed to repeat.
I mean, possibly. We don't know anything about that side of it. Like, we don't know if there's any sentience involved or anything.
So if there was sentience, do you think the curse on the house could be broken?
I think so.
You mean if it was like literally a ghost is possessing it and is conscious that it's doing it?
Yeah, like...
I mean, what would you say? Like, I don't know, the person who did this to you is dead like 100 years ago? Like, what can you do?
I was thinking that I would think about what the ghost wants, and I think the ghost wants the world to know what happened to him. So I would, like, I don't know, see if he had any family I could go tell, or like see if any journalists are snooping for a 100-year-old scandal or something.
Yeah, but like the thing is, you're assuming a motive there, and you have no idea what the motive actually is.
It could be that they want justice. In which case, how do you give justice for someone that's long dead? And who all the main players are dead. Like, how do you forgive if the people aren't around to be forgiven?
You see my point here? If it wants something, we have no way of knowing what it is. So we can't help. You're just guessing. It kind of makes it worse.
True, unless you find some way to communicate with the haunted house.
That could be an interesting development.
What would happen if you tried to play with it? Would it, like, take your fingers off or something?
I have no idea.
Okay, so what did you think about the end of the story, which he is going to sell it to somebody very unfortunate in America?
I thought there was maybe a 30% chance that this story was going to end with him like realizing that he's actually a doll inside a bigger doll's house.
That would have been
maybe
cool.
I've watched too many science fiction movies.
I would have enjoyed that.
Or some personal connection.
It was just kind of ended, didn't it? It was fine.
How would you have improved upon the ending?
I know not every story has to have like a big moment or anything. I mean, I like the big dramatic endings, but you don't always have to do it. This ending is just fine. It's not impressive. It's just an ending.
I mean, again, it's very classic ghost story, isn't it? In the sense of like of the kind you tell where the house is still out there, which means that one day you too could have the house.
Yeah, it's an open
And
ending.
it will tell you the story that you already know. Oh no, the horror.
Also, if you happen to pick up the haunted doll's house, you would just be like, yawn, I already know this story, you guys aren't impressing me.
I just feel like it's missing some kind of level of threat that most horror stories have.
True. But then it's not a horror story, it's a ghost story. They're not the same thing. Like, horror might use ghosts, but a ghost story is its own thing still.
This is definitely a horror story, though.
Is it?
Yeah, I think so.
Why?
It has all the tropes. It has murder. It has suspense about what's going to happen. I mean, it has child murder. That's pretty horror. It has
true.
unsolved mysteries and how this thing came to exist. It has things that we don't understand. It's horror. Come on. I mean, what else is it? Are you telling me this is a romance?
I was going to say it's a ghost story, but not a horror story.
What's the difference between a ghost and a horror story?
Trying to think how to put it.
Is it perhaps that ghosts are more human than most other creatures you might come across in horror?
You can write a horror story with just humans.
I mean, horror, I think, isn't limited to ghosts. Well, obviously, a ghost story is limited to ghosts. I think also ghost stories often lack the same kind of level of shock. Like, they're often milder than a horror story is. Like, a horror story is trying to absolutely horrify you. Well, I get the feeling like this story isn't, really. Like, what happens is horrific, but it's not out to, like, scare the undying fear, put the fear of God into you or anything. It's more about, it's an out of balance kind of situation. There's like something that needs to be put right, while a horror has something like actively out to get you.
Okay, so like there's a lack of aggression.
Yeah, like it's like implicity versus explicitity. Explicitness. Like horror is explicit. Ghost stories, I think, are subtler often. Like Bly Manor, for example, is a ghost story, but it's also a love story. Like, I think that's its opening line or something. Like, I don't know quite what I'm trying to get at, but there's something there, I think. Like,
I found parts of Bly Manor quite horrifying, like the facelessness of the apparitions were also possession, quite horrifying.
So, according to M.R James, our author, and summarized by some dude called Frank Kaufman, so the 5 key features of the English ghost story are the pretense of truth, a pleasing terror, no gratuitous bloodshed or sex, no explanation of the machinery, and setting of those of the writer's and reader's own day.
Ah,
Seems
okay.
very arbitrary to me.
Interesting, though, because horror, for example, is definitely open to gratuitous bloodshed and sex, and often does explain its machinery. Like, often in horror, half the point is the explanation. Like, you delve deep into this psychopath who's trying to kill everyone. Like, the whole point of the story is unraveling the mystery of, oh god, why is the killer after us? Like, oh, it's the creepy curse, or they were abused as a child, or whatever else.
I don't think that's a necessary part of a horror story. I don't know. All I'm hearing is that this is a horror story for wimps, which makes sense.
Are we agreed to disagree?
I would agree that maybe it's not a horror story, but I feel like it doesn't serve any other purpose that I personally appreciate. I think it would be better if it was a horror story.
I guess if it was more of a horror story, the dolls might come out and try and get the protagonist or something. I think maybe that's what we're trying to say here, that there's not a really explicit threat to the person who owns the dollhouse. They're just a bit creeped out by it. Whereas in a full-on horror, they would be like absolutely running for their life from this thing.
I don't know, it just feels set up like in the way that the horror movie often is.
So, according to James, the point of the story is that it must put the reader into position of saying to himself, if I'm not very careful, something of this kind may happen to me. So the point isn't horror, the point is morality, kind of morality warning tale with ghosts.
Oh, okay. What's the moral of this story then? Don't sell cursed objects.
Yeah, well, be careful what you buy, maybe.
Or don't murder your granddad.
Well, yeah, there is that.
It's an interesting chap, M.R. James. I have some interesting things to say about him later on. Well, actually now, probably. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
We were talking earlier about how we didn't necessarily think the opening was necessary because we already obviously know that he's going to come into possession of this haunted dollhouse. But apparently another key element of the M.R James style is that to him the two ingredient is that it's really important to open the story in a placid way, so to see the characters going about their ordinary business undisturbed and pleased, so that then you can have something kind of ominous put out its head unobtrusively at first, and then more insistently until it holds the stage, apparently.
Oh, I suppose he means it's so he grounds it first in reality, which then helps his later idea, which is to make it think that it could happen to you because he's grounded it at the beginning. Yeah, that makes sense. Alrighty. I would like to just say a bit about the story because it has an interesting history. It was written for a book in Queen Mary's dollhouse. This dollhouse was made as a thank you gift for her because she did a lot of good things for soldiers in World War One. She was the wife of Henry V. Several famous authors at the time contributed short stories to it, and this was the one M.R James put in, which I think is kind of funny because it's about a terrifying doll's house, and her doll's house is actually quite nice and fancy, and you can go see it at Windsor Castle if you want. Arthur Conan Doyle also put in a short story, which I think is quite famous, called How Watson Learned the Trick. You can read it online if you want. It's very short. It's funny. I like it. So there is somewhere, well, in Windsor Castle, a tiny, tiny version of this story inside a doll's house. It's just so good. I love it. The other, I guess, the most notable thing about M.R. James is that he has a very strong history with Cambridge University. He attended King's College. He became really well known for his ghost stories. He lived there for years, from being a student to a fellow. He even became the director of the Fitzwilliam Museum, which is sort of the city's museum. And he would have people down to tell them ghost stories. So he would welcome them in like a room full of candles. And then when he started telling the story, he would blow all the candles out so there was only one kind of lighting up his face. And then he would tell the story, which sounds great. And I think I'd actually quite like to try telling a story like that. I think it would be quite fun.
I did this at school.
You did that at school, really?
Yeah, I had a really wacky media studies teacher, and one day he brought in candles and told us all ghost stories that totally happened to him.
So today, the M.R. James is a fabulous source for ghost tours that go around Cambridge. Been to one, it was pretty good. There are also regular readings by candlelight at the Manor in Hemmingford Grey, which is kind of out in the sticks in Cambridgeshire, but it looks fun. So I'd love to go to one of them and see what it's like. He's the originator of the antiquarian ghost story, which I'm not really sure what it means, but I think it means someone interested in old ghost stories, as far as I can tell. And going back to what Simone was saying earlier, Wikipedia said that the classic Jamesian, I think that's how you say it, tale includes the following elements: a characterful setting in an English village, seaside town, or country estate, or an ancient town in France, Denmark, or Sweden, an abbey, or a university. I guess he just means like somewhere grand and old by characterful. A nondescript and rather naive gentleman scholar as protagonist, often reserved. I think that fits protagonist of this story as well. He's not very proactive as a protagonist. And the discovery of an old book or other object that somehow unlocks, cools down the wrath, or attracts the unwelcome attention of a supernatural menace from beyond the grave. I think that sounds about right. So I guess these are all very classic things that you find in ghost stories. Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment on our website, shortstoryworkshop.com, to let us know what you thought. You can also find all our previous short stories and episodes. We'll be back with another story in 2 weeks. Goodbye.